Everybody good? Do we have a sign-in sheet going around? Can we? All right, so we left off with intolerable acts. Through colonial newspapers and what they called back then, and what had recently been formed since the stamp act crisis, committees of correspondence in each of the colonies, who, as you might guess, were committees that corresponded with one another. News of this spreads relatively quickly, and people outside of Boston and other colonies, as far away as down here in Savannah, begin to think, just like with the Boston Massacre, if they can do this to Massachusetts, if they can essentially put Massachusetts under a military occupation and suspend their colonial charter and send troops back under the leadership of a governor who is a general, they could do this to us. They could do it to Georgia or Virginia or New York. And so there's this, one of the first concerted efforts to come together as 13 colonies as one and to think about, how to respond, what can we do to protect ourselves if the British Crown and Parliament attempt to do something similar to us. And so the representatives of most of the 13 colonies meet in what becomes known as the First Continental Congress. So representatives, delegations from all but I think one. Do anyone want to venture a guess which one colony did not send representatives to the First Continental? Yeah. Georgia did not, but they will come around by the time of the Second Continental Congress. But what do they do? The short answer is not a lot. I mean, they come together to discuss this possibility that something similar could happen, and they resolve to go back to their respective home colonies and to tell their people to start training as militia, to start arming themselves and training. And I used that word in another class, and I'm like, what the hell is militia? Sorry. It's like, I would equate it today with what we have institutionalized in the National Guard. Not professional soldiers, but average people who could train as soldiers, as needed. The difference here is they're not authorized by the Crown or by Parliament. And once British high officials hear about this kind of thing, they're going to try to nip it in the bud and put a stop to it. But that was what the First Continental Congress did. The representatives go back to their respective colonies and say, hey, local people, even at the town level, you need to start stockpiling weapons and you need to start drilling or training. In the event that you have to, protect your life, your home, your family, your town from some kind of, invasion by the British professional army. Come back to that. So, this obviously includes Massachusetts. And there is the new governor, General Thomas Gage, in Boston, with a contingent of 3,000 British troops. And he gets word that, what was at that time, like out in the countryside, in the town of Concord, that they were stockpiling weapons. And this is, in a manner of speaking, illegal. I mean, you cannot, without authorization, just decide to arm and train yourselves and drill as militia without the blessing of the king. And so Gage resolves to march out with about half of his contingent of 3,000 troops to Concord to seize the guns. And he sets out at night, and this is that moment, of course, where Paul Revere is part of a team of individuals. I totally forgot. Huh?
I can come back another day.
Do you want to?
Yeah, you've already
Since I've
started.
already started? Okay, you want to come back Tuesday?
Tuesday's good.
Okay,
I'll see
perfect.
you then.
See you then. That's Jen with Trio. She's going to talk to you guys about what is Trio, and if you qualify for it, it's actually a huge help. So we'll see about that next week. So this is that moment at which Paul Revere, for whatever reason, gets all the credit. But he's part of a group of individuals who had established a possible warning system to ride out to Concord and to warn these people, and including the town of Lexington, which Gage and his troops would pass through on their way out to Concord and say, hey, these troops are coming out here, be ready to defend yourself. Defend your town and your family and your property. That they do. And the British troops get to Lexington then, and there are these militia, these everyday townspeople, merchants and doctors and lawyers and craftsmen and farmers, standing there with their guns in formation, up against representatives of probably the most highly trained army in the world at that time. So it's a definite mismatch. And this is also the moment of the famous or infamous, however you want to put it, shot heard around the world, similar to the Boston Massacre. Somebody fires, we don't know who, but if you have people standing in front of one another, everybody with a gun, and someone fires a gun, typically this is going to go poorly. There's a massive exchange of gunfire, and several of the colonists are killed. Not yet any of the British soldiers. Remember, professionally trained to do this. But they march on from Lexington to Concord, and a similar exchange occurs with the militia at Concord, only this time several British troops are killed in the gunfire. But they get to their objective, seize some of the weapons, and now what to do? You have to turn around and march back the way you came. And now it's broad daylight. And now word has gone out all over the countryside to other towns and everywhere else, all throughout Massachusetts, of what has just happened. And what has just happened is not just British troops marching out to these towns, but they have now killed colonists again. And now the word is, hey, the colonists are coming. Every farmhouse had a gun of some kind. And now these British troops who don't know the area or not from here have to march on this road all the way back to Boston. And guess who does know the area and knows every turn in the road, everywhere there's a rock wall to hide behind, everywhere there's good cover where you could hide and pop up and ambush every one of these yellow dots, ambush that line of marching British soldiers. And this is where the real significant bloodshed occurs. By the time Gage gets back to Boston, he has something like 200 or 300 casualties among his troops. So the colonists have done serious damage to this returning column of British troops going back to Boston, and then they surround and besiege the city of Boston. At this point, a Second Continental Congress convenes while Boston is besieged by colonial militia. And they decide at first what they'll do is, appeal directly to the king as the king's good subjects. So set aside dealing with Parliament for now. We'll send this petition to the king to say we can still work this out. This doesn't have to devolve into a war. Let's work together. And the king basically gives them the middle finger and says, it's over. We're now going to go to war. We're going to bring you colonists to heel and show you what's what and who's who. And so at that point, the Continental Congress, among other things, decides to appoint George Washington, who, as you know, doesn't exactly have a really great military record up to that point, but who is a wealthy tobacco planter. He'd been an officer in the British ranks for some time. They decide to appoint him to essentially go to Boston and turn that group of ragtag militia into some kind of continental army for the purpose of fighting for independence from Britain. And this was not what they would call, you've ever heard the phrase, a fait accompli. It was always going to be this way. That was not the case. Not everyone prior to this point was convinced that, just because you were mad about internal taxes or the Townshend Acts or the Tea Act or whatever it may be, that you needed to fight a war for revolution and independence. But by this moment in 1776, enough people were convinced of that that not only will the Second Continental Congress give Washington charge of a continental army and declare for the creation of a continental currency or money, so you didn't have to depend on the British pound, but they will also put another Virginia tobacco planter named Thomas Jefferson and several others in charge with drafting a Declaration of Independence. And that will end this one, and we begin the next. Questions?
Just a mild change of question. Was John Locke a colonist? Did he ever go to America?
He was not. He asked a really good question that we'll speak to here in just a minute. He was a generation before. But what's important is that the people like Jefferson are reading John Locke very, very, very closely. And so we're going to actually pick apart the Declaration and say, this is what comes from Locke. This is what comes from Locke.
That's what I thought, but the book alluded to, made it sound like as if he actually was in America.
That's interesting. I don't think he ever visited the colonies. I could be wrong about that. He's an Englishman. It's certainly possible. Yes.
Oh, I was just going to ask, Paul Revere, the group he was in, was that the Minutemen?
The Minutemen were the militia in the little towns. Revere was associated with that, but when I say he's a group of people, it was just a handful of people who were responsible for the one if by land, two if by sea, we're going to ride out and get news to the Minutemen in Lexington and Concord that the British are coming. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. The Minutemen were the name given to the militia in Massachusetts, with the idea being that if Revere and these others rode out and warned you that troops are coming, you could be ready at a minute's notice. It's a good question. All right, so in the past, I have lectured on the actual Revolutionary War, and it is very interesting to me. Regrettably, though, in 2110, you have to do it all in one semester. Certain things don't make it, and the actual battlefield history is one of those things that didn't make it. So I know. I'll allude to it maybe here and there, but what we're really concerned with today is the ideas of the revolution, the ideology behind what these colonists see themselves as doing. And we'll talk about it in these three documents. The Declaration of Independence first, then America's first Constitution, which is known as the Articles of Confederation, and then finally, of course, the Constitution that replaces the Articles of Confederation and that we still live and operate under today. So this is just picking up right where we left off. Second Continental Congress convenes, appoints Washington, puts him in charge of the developing of a continental army. He goes to Boston. The first battle of the war takes place there. It's the Battle of Bunker Hill. And Washington then has the unenviable task of facing the most highly trained army, as I said, and probably best equipped army in the world, and has to essentially create an army for himself from scratch almost. And meanwhile, the Second Continental Congress appoints this group of 5 individuals as a committee to draft a statement of intention, if you will. A statement laying out, these are the reasons why we feel it necessary to fight a war to obtain our independence. So to put that another way, to draft a Declaration of Independence. This is why we're seeking our freedom from Britain and to become our own nation. That committee, in turn, essentially gives the bulk of that work to another Virginia tobacco planter, Thomas Jefferson, who is largely responsible for the language of the Declaration of Independence. Before we kind of pick through that line by line, though, let's look at what are the ideological influences here. First of all, in the preceding 100 years or so, in what we might call Western thought, that is the thinking and writing of scholars in Western Europe and by proxy here in America, you've been experiencing what we call the Enlightenment. It's a European intellectual movement that challenged traditional institutions of authority. The European intellectual movement that challenged traditional institutions of authority. Challenged traditional institutions of authority. If we are talking about European or Western history up to this point, going back 1,000 years, what were the two major institutions of authority? Kings and queens, monarchies, yes, that's one. The other is the church, right? So Enlightenment philosophers, Enlightenment thinkers begin to systematically challenge what they had been told by monarchies and by the church for 1,000 years. One branch of that is the creation of modern science and rejecting things about the physical world that you had been told by, for example, the Roman Catholic Church. Another branch of that comes to fruition in the birth of modern political philosophy. But one more thing about the Enlightenment. We talk about an intellectual movement challenging traditional institutions of authority and questioning them. Where, historically speaking, would these scholars or philosophers look for better examples of institutions or ideologies in European history? You would have to go back where? To the ancient Greece and Rome, to the age of what's sometimes called the classical world or classical antiquity, to the days of the greatness of Greece and Rome.
Or if you want to be crude, ancient Rome.
Ancient Rome, I've never heard that, but yes, considered oftentimes together. In fact, in my World History 1, starting next week, we have a whole 2 weeks on Greco-Roman civilization, or Greek and Roman civilization. If you study Greco-Roman civilization, you would be familiar with concepts like republicanism. The idea that rather than being subjects of a monarch or a king or queen, people could be citizens with some measure of equality among one another. Of course, who can be considered a citizen is historically limited, but citizens being equal could elect representatives to govern for them. That's the heart of a republican form of government, one in which citizens elect representatives to govern for them. At the heart of such a system, then, is the idea of the consent of the governed. Consent of the governed, meaning people are in positions of power in a government because we, the citizens, say they can do, right? By voting for them and electing them to these positions.
So the Enlightenment revived the republicanism and democracy system?
Yes. The Enlightenment is a revival of classical political philosophy and institutions of the classical world. As you are simultaneously questioning and rejecting the institutions of the many, many years that come between the classical world and the world in which you live in. And democracy. Ocracy, as we said, means government. Demos, as in demographics, means the people. So hand in hand with republicanism is the idea of a government by the people and an expansive consideration of who could be a citizen. Now, that's sort of the Enlightenment very broadly speaking. And if you study it a little more closely, you can see there's a Scottish Enlightenment and a French Enlightenment and different sort of subsets of political thought. And you would see, for example, in the Scottish Enlightenment, individuals like David Hume, who is among the first philosophers to discuss a natural philosophy, by which in part he meant thinking about philosophy completely separate from religion, to totally divorce the concept of philosophy and by proxy political philosophy without talking about religion at all. So divorcing philosophy from the concept of religion and considering it as a separate thing.
Science and religion don't mix.
Exactly, yes, precisely. And yes, there is, in fact, to your point, a whole other movement, you know, that would lead us to individuals like Isaac Newton, who gives us a first systematic basis for modern science as we know it that has nothing to do with institutionalized religion at all. Well, that's a bit of a stretch, but it's close. In any case, other Scottish Enlightenment thinkers would include people like Adam Smith. Adam Smith writes a book called The Wealth of Nations, in which he coins the term mercantilism and critiques it and says this was not the way to do things these previous 200 years or so, where you're just hoarding wealth in specie. You should be using that as capital to invest it and to grow the wealth of nations. He's the father of modern capitalism. And then in the French Enlightenment, you have people like René Rousseau, who is among the first to talk about the idea of a social contract. The idea that when we create governments, we enter into a contract with ourselves, with one another. Somewhat similar to what we saw with, in a microcosmic sense, very small sense, what the Pilgrims did with the Mayflower Conference. They're just citizens coming together and entering into a contract with one another. Part of social contract theory is that it's part of there are kind of two schools of thought in this part of Enlightenment thinking. One is what they call rationalist thought, associated with people like, you don't have to write this down, but René Descartes, who, like a lot of these philosophers, was also a mathematician and is responsible for the...
Isn't he I think I am the guy?
Yes, the Cartesian plane, the X, Y axis. But he's also associated with that little phrase, I think, therefore I am. He's a rationalist, meaning he believes in the primacy or the value of reason first. That as a philosopher, you should sit and think first and develop theories and ideas, and then you could test them in sort of the real world. The other school of thought is known as empiricism, as associated with people like Francis Bacon in England. These people believe in the primacy of observation first. Like observe, document, what do you see in the real world, what can you observe and calculate and document and write down. And then you can somehow study that, test that, and then arrive at sort of big ideas from that. The reason I mention this is because Rousseau's concept of social contract theory begins with a kind of observation. It begins with the observation of what they would call, or some would call, a state of nature. It means observing a theoretical world in which human beings exist, but there are no governments. And then thinking about what would or should it look like as people cooperate with one another and create governments. Like, what does that process look like as you come together and theoretically sign on to a social contract, which in the real world sense could come to mean a constitution, a document that you establish to function as the foundation for a government.
I feel like I might want to be quiet in this discussion, as I'm very firmly on the opposite side of this.
Yeah.
I might be a little bit of an anarchist.
All right. Well, hey, open forum, always. No worries. I thought you were going to go like Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan on me, but quite the opposite. We'll parse that out. So Rousseau is one of the fathers of social contract theory. We'll look at an example of what that might look like even more closely. Who else might we mention?
Nicholas Machiavelli.
Yes. The ruthless prince, indeed. I'm not going to be able to spell Montesquieu. I throw in the towel. Somebody help me.
Isn't that not how you spell it?
I think I'm at Montesquieu at this time.
Montesquieu. I mean, it looks like Montesquieu.
Yeah, it looks like Montesquieu.
U-I.
No, I. Oh, yeah.
Oh, it
No.
has a.
It's
Wait,
like,
help me out.
it's like Montesquieu.
I see you.
U-I-E-U?
Montesquieu.
He,
Oh, there's a
You
Q,
spelled it
right.
right. You spelled it right.
Damn. Oh, I did
Oh
put a
wait,
Q in
you
there.
just missed one U. But you had it right the first time.
All right.
It's almost like
U-I-E-U. Of course, how am I gonna have a Q with no U after it? Damn. Anyway, Montesquieu, among many other ideas, is the first to systematically argue in favor of a three-branch government, the dividing up of power in a government among three different branches, and the idea that each of those branches of a government could function to check or limit the power of the other two, so that you have an even balance of power within the government. A lot of this should sound really familiar to you if you're aware of the structure of our government. So,
If he defines the three branches, does that also mean he conceive check and balances?
yeah, yes. So let's look at one example of social contract theory. John Locke, and you mentioned Locke earlier. John Locke is an Enlightenment philosopher who lives and writes in the late 1600s. So it's good that you asked that question, because I want you to consider, when we're talking about Jefferson and these revolutionary colonists, this is a full generation later. So they're not contemporaries with Locke, but they are reading Locke. Some of the French Enlightenment philosophers would have been contemporary, but let's not digress any more than I already have. So John Locke begins observing the state of nature, right? Remember the theoretical world in which human beings exist, but we don't have governments yet. His point of departure, that is where you start, is that human beings are naturally cooperative. And we would want to cooperate with one another in a state of nature. And that we came together to sign on to a social contract and have this government created with the consent of the governed, that we would give very limited power to that government. And we would only surrender a small amount of our individual rights, and that it would then become the primary purpose of that government to protect our remaining individual rights. That's the most important statement of the day. John Locke argues the primary purpose of having a government, of forming a government, is to protect our individual rights. This is the concept of classical liberalism. Liber means freedom, as in the word liberty. So when we say liberalism in the classical sense associated with John Locke, we mean primarily the notion that the primary purpose of forming a government is to protect your individual rights. Most especially your individual rights to life, liberty, and property. Life, liberty, or freedom, and property. Those are, according to Locke, the most important functions of a government: to protect your individual rights to life, liberty, and property. And, says Locke, if a government were not to do its job in upholding or protecting your rights to life, liberty, and property, it would be your right to overthrow it and to replace it with one that did. All that making sense? Now, there were counter arguments to that. I mentioned a moment ago a guy named Hobbes, who kind of starts from the same point, state of nature, but says human beings are inherently bad and selfish and not cooperative at all, and that what you would need to do is surrender all your individual rights to, essentially absolute monarchy, and that this would be the most ideal form of government to have. Obviously, Locke disagreed with that. Oh, I forgot I included these. They look kind of chunky in that picture. I went to France last summer, and if you go to the Pantheon, some of these people are entombed there. And then if you go to the Louvre Museum, some of them are sculpted there, I guess you would say. This is Locke. This here is Olympe de Gouges, who I mentioned here in a moment. And then I guess that's, I can't see, is that, oh, that's Voltaire. Ah, right. Voltaire was the great French Enlightenment philosopher who published a lot essentially mocking the monarchy and the church and the idea of institutional religion in general. Can't see that one either. So what's the point of me including these if I can't see who anybody is? One of those I can tell you is Rousseau.
That's crazy. They don't even do stuff like that.
They what? Making sculptures and stuff like that? Yeah. And busts, if you will. Anyway, that was a little self-indulgence, but let us look very closely then at the Declaration of Independence. So to begin, obviously, I'm going to read this slowly, or recite, I guess, if I can. I expect you to write it down. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for a people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. Pause. In the course of human events, immediately we see this notion of this is all natural. It's natural rights. It's all very obvious to us. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary. This is by necessity. It's not just a choice. For people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, meaning we're dissolving our connection to Great Britain. We're dissolving our connection to the monarchy and parliament. To dissolve those political bands that have connected with one another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. To assume among the powers of the earth, by which he primarily meant, like these mother countries we're talking about, like Britain and France and Spain, a separate and equal station, meaning we should be one of these great powerful countries. And furthermore, it's entitled to us by nature and of nature's God. They very purposely keep the religious language ambiguous here.
Nobody do that.
Exactly. Not to alienate any one group of people or another. So we are entitled to this. It's all very natural. If this is going to happen, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to that separation. Translation: if you're going to engage in revolution and start your own country, you should tell people why you're doing it. Make sense? That's the preamble. It continues. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Again, it's obvious, it's natural rights. And then follows one of the more ironic lines penned in Western history, that all men are created equal. Thomas Jefferson, of course, owns human beings as property. So this is, in that way and many more, a deeply troubled statement. He does not mean enslaved men. He does not mean necessarily women. He does not mean Native Americans. And he might not even really mean all white men. But on the other side of it, to take devil's advocate view, consider European society where people are born with titles. And people are born as princes and kings and queens. And people are born into these wealthy aristocratic families that have owned this land and been, lord or baron, whatever, for generations. To make a blanket statement like this, obliterating that is still a significant thing. That's the argument, anyway. All men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Endowed by their Creator. Again, it's all natural, ambiguous religious language. We are endowed with unalienable rights, meaning we have rights that are natural that cannot be taken away. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. I think I skipped one of the significant parts. We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, especially life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So, even though the language is massaged a little bit to take property out and put in pursuit of happiness, which I always find to be great because we're such a materialistic society that our pursuit of happiness is the pursuit of property, That language comes directly from law. And he continues and said that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. That is the thesis of classical liberalism. That the purpose of forming a government primarily is to secure your individual rights, especially the life and freedom and property or the pursuit of happiness. And that if the government becomes destructive to those ends, it is the right of the people to overthrow and replace it with one that will. So the thesis of the Declaration of Independence is, in essence, the thesis of the central tenet of classical liberalism. What follows then is a list of grievances. Everything from here down. He has done this, he has done this, he has done this, he has done this. He being whom?
George III?
George III. I missed a trivia question last night. Elizabeth II, the queen who died recently, who did she replace? Yeah, well, I said George V. It was George VI. So there's a lot of Georges. So this George is George III.
Here's Shane.
Better than Francis Louis.
Yeah, God, there's so many Louis. That's so true. Anyway, so what follows is they put it in this language that the king has done this, the king has done this. They really mean the king and parliament. And in fact, if they mean one more than the other, they mean parliament. But doesn't it sound a lot worse and make you seem more oppressed if you just talk about the king as doing all these terrible things to us? They thought it did. What's in the list? Everything we just looked at in the last lecture. They've sent troops over here that have murdered us with impunity. They have put on us internal taxes that they have no authority to place on us. They purposely hit us with external taxes designed to pay off our judges and governors. They've, suspended our colonial charters for the purposes of some kind of unfair punishment, and so on and so on and so on, and many more things that we didn't mention in the previous lecture. These are the proof. This is the pudding that supports that thesis that was Britain's government is not protecting our individual rights. This is why we must engage in revolution. In case that was a little bit of high-minded language that the average colonist might not fully understand, they tasked a young printer from England named Thomas Paine with writing essentially the same thing in more plain language so it would just be common sense to the average colonist. And Paine takes it a little bit further by really taking down the idea of hereditary monarchy altogether and saying, what a stupid way of government, to say that someone gets to be king or queen just based on who they were born to. What if you end up with somebody who's a psychopath?
A lot of the songs that happen.
Exactly. What if you end up with somebody who's an idiot? And even let's just say for the sake of argument, Paine says that King George III is neither of those things, but when did he last set foot in the British North American colonies? And the answer was never. And he said, well, let's consider, it is a limited monarchy. We have a parliament, but do we get to elect members of that parliament? No. Do we have people who sit in the House of Lords with titles from the colonies? No. So why should this be our government? And then he goes on to make much of the same argument as Jefferson in tapping into the idea of classical liberalism. It was really what we might call a bestseller. It's hundreds of thousands of copies. It gets read aloud in the taverns for the benefit of people who maybe were not literate. And it goes a long way in convincing people who were kind of on the fence that really revolution was necessary. So, famously, the Continental Congress, which is operating at this point as America's de facto government, approves that document, the Declaration of Independence, we celebrated on January 4, but didn't they actually approve it on the 3rd or the 5th? I don't remember.
I think it got sent on the 4th after it was approved on the 3rd.
Okay, that makes sense, yeah.
I thought it was the 2nd, and John Adams really thought it was gonna be celebrate then, but it ended up being the 4th.
Yeah, that sounds right too. Yeah, there's some kind of quirk where we celebrated on the 4th, but it was either the 2nd or the 3rd. It was the actual official. Regardless, the Continental Congress at the same time tasked another committee with drafting what would essentially be the actual physical manifestation of the social contract, a constitution. And let me go back, it just occurred to me. When you're talking about social contract theory and consent of the governed, and especially when we're talking about a democratic republic of a representative government, what you're talking about doing is replacing the rule of kings with the rule of law. The law being, the foundational law being a constitution. And everything would rest on that foundation. And no person, even the highest officials in that government, would be above that foundational law. That's what the rule of law means. And that's what the Articles of Confederation would establish. Technically, the full title, as you can see there, the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union between the states. So 13 colonies would become 13 states, and they would be together in a union or a confederation. The number one characteristic of the government that's created by the Articles of Confederation is that most of the authority was vested in the states. Under this system, the individual 13 states would be given most of the authority to govern over people. Very little power is given to the central, or what we would call federal government. And it is a one-branch government as well that essentially maintains the structure of the Continental Congress. If we didn't talk about this before, the structure of the Continental Congress was that each colony, or now state, would send a delegation, could be 2 people, could be 10, but that delegation would get to cast on behalf of that state one vote and majority rules. And so the one branch is essentially what it sounds like, a Congress of delegations with each state casting one vote and with majority rule. But let's look here at a sum total list of the powers granted to the government under the Articles of Confederation, most of which deal with the immediate necessities of fighting the war, which I know I said we didn't have time to talk about, but I will say drags on for over half a decade. So, powers granted to the government under the Articles. Power to declare war and make peace. Obvious, right? Power to make treaties with foreign countries. As during the Revolution, America would make with France for military assistance. To establish an army and a navy. Already did that. You don't have to write all this down because it's in the PowerPoint. To appoint high-ranking military officials. Already did that. To requisition, print, and borrow money. Doing that. Establish dates of measurement. Standardization. And to hear disputes among the states related to trade or boundaries. That's it. There's nothing in there about, notably, taxation. There's nothing in there that says that you could require any kind of uniformity or cooperation on the part of the individual 13 states in terms of policy. And let's look at that when we talk about what are the problems. Well, the first one is ironic. Remember, Britain's war debt coming out of the 7 Years' War is what set in motion that chain of events that we just looked at in the previous lecture. And now the brand new American government is going to have debts of its own. How do you deal with that? In fact, not only does America, the federal government, have debts, the individual states will immediately incur debts of their own. And how do you deal with that? Well, some states might attempt to deal with that through taxation, but how does that work? Under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government did not have the authority to tax anybody. What they did is operate under a requisition system, where they basically determined this is the amount we need to run our very limited federal government, although at the time that includes staffing and provisioning the Army and Navy, so it's not that small. What do we need? What's the figure we can come up with? And then just tell the states, this is what we need from you as revenue. How the states came up with that was up to the state. So some different states could tax their people for different things and at different rates to come up with the amount they needed to give the federal government under the requisition system.
Is that why we got different taxes in different states?
That would be somewhat of a carryover from that. Although in the 20th century, we do have a federal income tax. So now the federal government can tax you. And in fact, before the federal income tax, it's still the federal government could establish like what they call excise taxes on like the making of whiskey, for example. So under our later Constitution, powers of the federal government are significantly expanded to give the federal government power to tax individuals and not just the state. Does that make sense? Now, a couple of other things on this before I move on to monetary. One, under the requisition system, you could not, in good conscience or fairness, ask for the same sum of revenue or tax money from Rhode Island, for example, as you did from New York or Virginia. There's a lot more wealth and whatnot in those very much larger states as opposed to the smaller ones. Do you know what the solution they came up with for this? So they determined we will ask for a certain amount of a given state based on the property value.
So we asked from each other.
Yeah, so well, they tell the states, we're going to add up, we're going to do a tally of what's the total value of property in, say, Georgia. And what's the total amount of property in, say, New York. And, probably, New York may be a little bit higher, depending. And then say, if the total property value is here, you owe the federal government X amount, versus in Rhode Island, if it's here, you're going to owe us way less. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but
So a state with more wealth would owe more money to the federal government under this system, right? Now, pause. I mentioned Georgia. Representatives from Georgia or say Virginia, why might they oppose such a system versus representatives from even New York or Massachusetts? What might they see as, oh shit, we're about to owe a whole lot because of property value?
Because you consider the large slave population.
Because under a chattel system, slaves were considered property. They're the most valuable commodity in the 13 states, and the slave states of the South were about to owe way, way more if such a system were put in place. So what did they do? They came up with what they call the federal ratio, and this number is going to sound familiar to you because it survives in our Constitution for a different reason. They come up with the notion that the slave states could tally up their total slave population property value of those enslaved people, and to pay 3/5 of that, to pay taxes on 3/5 of that value, right? Now, hold on to that number, and again, it was probably familiar to you. We'll talk again about this federal ratio. Finally, last thing on taxation, again, the different states could do it differently. At the same time, states could also pursue their own monetary policy. And so what that means is, in addition to a continental pound or a currency that was used throughout the 13 states, every state had their own paper currency as well. So it's like a Massachusetts pound and then a New York pound or whatever, different names. But not only that, some states just went buck wild and print paper money. What happens when you drastically increase the amount of paper money?
Mass inflation.
Yeah, money is like any other commodity. The more of it there is, the less value it has. And the less value it has, the more it takes to purchase things, meaning prices are inflated, i.e. inflation, as you are well aware of. We're dealing with now.
But in terms of inflation in the colonies, there was also a secondary problem because during the Revolutionary War, they were trying to use their own currency called the Continental Dollar.
Yeah.
And not only did they make the money printing mistake, on top of that, since their currency was not legal, it was not illegal for the government to counterfeit it.
Ooh, yeah. And there are going to be a lot of soldiers who end up holding IOUs basically that are worthless towards the end of the war.
They did get eventually paid a percentage of their value by the government and by a bunch of rich people. Separate events.
Yeah, and if anybody watches Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, as we'll see, is one of the ones responsible for figuring out how the hell to fix all that mess that you're talking about. And it is a hot mess. So some states are just printing the hell out of money and it ends up being worthless, like the Continental. Other states, like let's say Massachusetts, are super, super tight about it. And when they do that, it makes it harder for like average people that are farmers to meet their debt obligations, especially if a state like Massachusetts is one of those who's taxing the hell out of their farmers.
If you want to know why people like print and make more money when it causes inflation, there are times in history where there is physically not enough money in existence to make a purchase.
Mm-hmm.
Like after I believe after World War I, there was like enough wealth and property for like people to bail out the French government.
Yeah.
There's not enough francs, in the world.
Exactly. And so, we look at this and it seems one-sided, but there are obviously arguments to be made for the states that are doing it one way versus the other. And historically speaking, for the federal government as well. Considering all of this, before we go to the last point, trade, the upshot in I mentioned Massachusetts, there's a rebellion. Very quickly, in the new American nation of farmers in Massachusetts who are upset about being taxed to death and the government not printing enough paper money, what do? What's the federal government do? There's nothing in here that says, here's what happens when there's a rebellion in one of the states. It doesn't even say what would the states do if there's a rebellion in one of the states. So that rebellion goes a long way in convincing people we might need to look at revising the Articles of Confederation. Finally, on trade, states could pursue their own trade policy. And if you're talking about the young American nation, once it wins the revolution and Britain gives up, when Britain gives up, they're not going to let America, the new nation, have the same privileges as America, the colonies, meaning you're out of the British colonial empire. You're now considered another country, so you don't get trade privileges with Barbados or Jamaica or the Bahamas or wherever anymore.
And somehow Britain ends up being our best trade partner anyway.
Right, indeed. After another war that we'll talk about later. But the point is, some states retaliated on Britain and said, well, your ships aren't welcome in our ports either. But what good is it, and I don't remember which ones it was, but let's just say, for example, one of those states that did that was Georgia. So, no, Britain, your ships can't do business in the port of Savannah. What good is that if South Carolina didn't do the same thing and the British ships just start doing business in Charleston? And the point is, it's not any good. Remember, a boycott only works if it is uniform. So for these and other reasons, in 1787, the states send representatives to a convention in Philadelphia. And I'm going to make this clear to be very important. My stutter is terrible today. They met for the purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. That is why they were sent to Philadelphia. To say, what can we do to kind of fix some of these problems? It was pretty clear that there was going to have to be some kind of expansion of the power and authority of the federal government. Perhaps at the expense of the states. But it had to happen. And there are different ideas about how far to go with that. Now, one of the people, probably more than any other, in fact, to come into that convention hall with a fully formed plan in mind was yet another Virginia tobacco planter, James Madison. And he would be supported in that by the other delegates from his home state. Thus, his plan becomes known as the Virginia Plan. The point of departure for the Virginia Plan was to do away with the Articles of Confederation altogether. In other words, to ignore the call to revise them and to instead metaphorically throw them in the trash bin and start over. And then to establish a more robust, a more powerful federal government with 3 branches, not just a Congress or legislative representative branch, but also an executive, administrative branch, and also a judiciary branch of courts. And one of the other major characteristics of Madison's plan was that representation in the Congress and the legislative branch would not be like it was under the Articles and as it was under the Continental Congress. Remember, where each state had one delegation, one vote. Instead, for Madison, population would determine votes. You would have population-based representation. That's the key element for our purposes of the Virginia plan is population-based representation in the legislative branch. Meaning, for every X number of people, let's just throw out and say every 10,000 people, every 100,000 people, you would get one representative in Congress, right? And for Madison, the idea behind one of the ideas behind this is then you could look to that Congress and instead of saying, I'm from Virginia or I'm from Georgia, that's my delegation of people, they represent me, and cast one vote for me and everybody else. You could look at Congress and a single individual and say, that is my representative, right? Like, right now, in the U.S. Congress, Hank Johnson is my representative. A single individual you could look at and say, he represents me and this sort of district of people. Now, of course, who is going to take issue with moving away from a system in which all the states have an equal one vote to one in which if you have more people, you're going to get more votes?
Smaller
Small
states?
Right. And so a competing plan is put forth by the delegates from New Jersey, which was at that time a small state, which begins with the point of departure of keeping the Articles of Confederation and keeping the Continental Congress style system of one state, one vote in the Congress, and simply expanding the role and the powers of the federal government to include things like making laws that were binding on individual citizens and not just the states. And that might include, for example, taxation at the federal level. Now, what do we end up with? A compromise plan is put forth by the representatives from Connecticut. It becomes known as the Great Compromise. They adopt elements of the Virginia plan, including doing away with the Articles of Confederation as your starting point, creating a three-branch government, a legislative, executive, and judicial. And you say, okay, well, this all sounds like the Madison, Virginia plan. Where's the compromise? It's within the legislative branch. The idea was to have a bicameral legislature. What does that mean? Two houses, yeah. Bicameral legislature in which in the Senate or the upper chamber or upper house you had equal representation among all the states. But not just the delegation system, it was 2 senators for each state voting independently. And so no longer would they have to vote the same and cast one vote. You have 2 senators from every state, no matter how big or small, casting their own individual vote. And then the House of Representatives, population-based representation, just like Madison wanted, but only in the lower house. Now, what other things could we say about this new constitutional government? Remember when we talked about, we threw out Montesquieu, we said with this notion of a 3-branch government, you could envision each branch having the ability to check or limit the authority of the other 2, and then have checks on its own power as well, with the idea that you would balance out power among the 3 branches. They were very concerned about this. Imagine a people who were overthrowing a government with a king, and you're talking about establishing an executive branch that will have a president. People were worried that that president could take on or assume powers similar to a king. So they made sure to limit the president's power. So what are some of the checks that the other 2 branches have on the power of the president?
Congress has a 2/3 policy.
Yeah, so to ask it another way, what would be a check that the president has on the power of the legislature?
Veto.
Veto power. Congress passes a law, president doesn't like it, he can veto that. But what if that gives too much power to the president? What you said first, Doug.
The 2/3 vote.
You can override the president's veto if 2/3 of the members of Congress vote for something. It can become law without the president's signature. What else? What about the court? How do justices become Supreme Court justices?
Elected by the executive.
You should take it back a step further. They're appointed by the president, but they have to be approved in the Senate, right? Balancing it out.
And
They're given life appointments with the idea that they will not, become too much of a political branch. But they can be impeached or removed. Speaking of which, limit on the power of the president. Impeachment, which, as you know, does not mean removal from office. It means that the House of Representatives can bring charges against a president because no one is above the law, no one is above the Constitution, but the president is also a citizen entitled to a trial in the Senate, and the Senate can vote to remove a president or not. We have not had a president removed from office. We would have in the case of Richard Nixon, but he resigned.
We should have.
Save that debate. But there have been other, in addition to the more recent examples of impeachment, Bill Clinton was impeached and won the trial. Andrew Johnson, and after the Civil War, we'll talk about, is impeached, and he probably also should and would have been removed from power, but he essentially cut a deal. But anyway, not to linger here for too long, there are other checks and balances, but I want to consider something else here and get back to this. Now, earlier we were talking about the more property you had in a state, the more taxes you had to pay under the Articles, right? So they came up with this compromise here because the slave states were saying, no, you can't count slaves, that's not fair, we'll owe way too much money, we need a compromise. Now that we're talking about representation, and the more people you have, the more representatives you get in the House of Representatives, guess who has changed their mind about whether or not slaves count? Guess whose tune has done a complete 180 and they're saying, oh yes, clearly slaves should count, they're human beings after all. We definitely should get, in Georgia, more representatives in Congress because we have more human beings that are enslaved. Yeah. And the northern states are like, oh, that's really interesting that you made completely the opposite argument when it was about how much money you owed. What they did is pluck this federal ratio that had existed under the Articles and apply it to representation, the 3/5 compromise. Meaning, slave states of the South would get to count 3/5 of their total slave population when calculating representation in the House. Make sense? Now, where else is slavery in the Constitution, even though they really go out of their way using legal terminology to avoid using the word slave, slavery, master, owner?
Others.
Yeah. Others held to labor for another and stuff like that. But make no mistake, slavery is 100% protected in the U.S. Constitution. It's the only reason the Southern delegates signed off on it. There's a fugitive slave clause. It says just because one person, again, stupid legal language, bound to labor for another, escapes that state and finds themselves in a state where slavery has been outlawed, i.e. by this point, all the northern states. Doesn't make you free. In fact, that property must be delivered to that property owner, meaning you had to be returned to your rightful owner and master if you were a quote-unquote fugitive. And then finally, there was some debate by this point. The American enslaved population had grown so dramatically that people began to worry, what if there's so many slaves and only so many masters and overseers, and there's like a slave revolution, which if it seemed like far-fetched, that was literally about to happen in Haiti, and others had attempted to make it happen in America. And so they're like, maybe, you know, our population of enslaved people is self-sustaining. Do we really need to keep importing slaves from abroad, from the Caribbean, or from Africa? Should we shut down the international slave trade, in other words? And in the Constitution, there is a clause that basically punts on that and says, we won't do that for the next 20 years, and then we'll come back and revisit it and see if we want to cancel the international slave trade at that time. Questions? And when they do revisit it, they do shut it down. But as we'll see in a later lecture, that didn't mean, I mean, the domestic slave trade was very, very, very lively, and we'll talk about that.
Does the 20 years clause tie into how some delegates at the Constitution Division expected the Constitution to be revisited like regularly in like 2-decade intervals or 5-year intervals?
Yes, and to that point, you know, we sort of take it as a given, an historical fact that here's your Constitution, it's going to last forever because we're still operating under it today. Obviously, they didn't know that then. Well, consider what they were doing is replacing the Constitution they just put in place several years before. So there was no sort of guarantee that this would be the tie that binds for you know, hundreds of years to come. That being said, or dovetailing with that, and I know we only have 7 minutes left, but I think we can get there. Maybe not, but at least let me make one point. They could not walk out of the convention hall and just say, here's your new Constitution. Remember, legally speaking, they were only there to revise the Constitution that you had. And they just decided to not do that. I mean, they literally, during the convention, are like, let's draw the curtains and let's shut our mouths for a few weeks while we do this and just see what happens. But you had to take it back to your respective states and let people vote on it as to whether they approved it or not. In other words, there would be a vote in every state for ratification. Ratification means the adoption of the Constitution or not. And this is a process that would take place over many, many weeks and months. And so there was essentially a campaign where people who supported this Constitution went out and argued in favor of it. Those people are known as the Federalists. People who were not in favor of it, people who opposed it and did not want to see it become the new law of the land, become known then as the Anti-Federalists. The most prominent Federalist, you could guess that list would include James Madison. It would also include New York merchant Alexander Hamilton. It would include another individual, a lawyer named John Jay. Those three people published anonymous essays in favor of all different aspects of the Constitution. Madison tackles the legislative stuff. Hamilton takes on the economic stuff, the monetary stuff. Jay talks about the legal system. And these papers, these essays, become known as the Federalist Papers. Essays in favor of the different, or explaining the rationale behind the different aspects of the Constitution. Opponents publish essays as well, including the prominent anti-federalist Mercy Otis Warren, who makes the case that, number one, it's an illegal document because you did not have the authority to do away with the previous Constitution. Number two, you went overboard, taking power away from the states and gave way too much power to the federal government. Where are the protections for the power of the states? What about, to put it another way, states' rights? And furthermore, she says, we're supposed to be classical liberals here and upholding the ideas of Locke, according to our Declaration of Independence. Where are the protections for individual rights? I do not see, she says, in this Constitution, protections for certain very, very important individual rights, like our freedom of speech, or our freedom from an established religion, or our freedom of assembly, and so on.
That came down to a bit of a thought that was derived from the fact that the Bill of Rights they were asking for was based on the English Bill of Rights, and it's
Right.
basically just anything we don't write down, you don't have.
Right.
Yeah, the point of government is that you have a few rights that are taken away,
Yeah.
and you get to keep everything else. This way, we give you a few rights, and you lose everything else.
Right, yeah, and they would, and she would point, and others would point and say, even the damn British, you mentioned the English Bill of Rights from 100 years before, they had a Bill of Rights that protected certain of those individual rights. And she says, we broke away from that, and now we don't have it? We need it in writing, it needs to be in the Constitution. Now, final points, obviously the Anti-Federalists lost, the Constitution is ratified, but two things, and you can look closer at this map if you want, it was pretty close in a lot of areas. There were a lot of votes against it. But two, the Anti-Federalists win in part in the long run because it was agreed that immediately upon ratification, we would add 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, as we come to know it, that would address major Anti-Federalist concerns. And say we do have a right as individual citizens to freedom of speech, a free press, freedom from an established religion, the right to bear arms in a well-regulated militia, the right to a fair and speedy trial, and the right to be free from excessive fines and punishments, and on and on. And then the last two, it says, this is not the sum total list of all of your rights, to your earlier point a moment ago. And then finally, any rights that are not expressly given to the federal government are reserved by the states. So that was the compromise. The Constitution is ratified in 1789. That is that. We got caught up remarkably, so no Bagley effect on Tuesday. Thank you, and have a great weekend. If you have questions, I'll stick around and answer them.
I didn't see the sign sheet. This one,
Uh,
the last one.
Did we have a sign-in sheet? We've got it right here.
Yeah, I did. And about last time, I was here, actually, 30 minutes before.
I remember that and being confused.
I was so like, I was like,